Welcome to the award-winning Thoughts from a Page podcast, a member of the Evergreen Podcasts Network, hosted by me, Cindy Burnett, a voracious reader and book columnist who provides you with casual author conversations, book recommendation episodes, and insider information on all of the newest releases that I have read and endorse, and on the publishing industry in my behind-the-scenes series. With so many books coming out weekly, it can be hard to decide what to read, so I find the best ones and share them with you. For more book recommendations or to find my backlist of interviews, visit my website at thoughtsfromapage.com. In 2023, I have a new segment on my Tuesday episodes called Read-alike Requests. Listeners can submit a book they loved and tell me why they loved it, and I will suggest some similar reads. There is a Google form included in today's show notes if you would like to send in a request. If you love to read, I hope you'll consider joining my Patreon group to access additional content, including bonus episodes and early reads with pre-pub author chats. For March, there are two books, Colleen Oakley's new book, The Mostly True Story of Tanner and Louise, and Fifth Avenue Glamour Girl by Renee Rosen. And for April, my selection is The Comeback Summer by writing duo Allie Brady. The link to join is in the show notes. Today, I am chatting with Sally Page about The Keeper of Stories. After studying history at university, Sally moved to London to work in advertising. In her spare time, she studied floristry at night school and eventually opened her own flower shop. She came to appreciate that flower shops offer a unique window into people's stories, and she began to photograph and write about this floral life in a series of nonfiction books. In her debut novel, The Keeper of Stories, Sally combines her love of history and writing with her abiding interest in the stories people have to tell. She now lives in Dorset. I hope you enjoy our conversation. And now for a quick break. For the last year, I have been focusing more on my health and eating habits. In connection with that, I have started drinking AG1 in the morning. When I started drinking AG1 daily, I could feel a real difference in my health and energy levels. That is because AG1 is a foundational nutrition supplement that supports your body's universal needs like gut optimization, stress management, and immune support. Since 2010, AG1 has led the future of foundational nutrition, continuously refining their formula to create a smarter, better way to elevate your baseline health. I recommend AG1 to all of my family and friends because the company has a team of doctors and scientists. It is tested for 950 contaminants and is NSF certified for sport. It is formulated based on the latest science, and it maintains high quality standards. Thanks AG1 for sponsoring my show. AG1 is a supplement I trust to provide the support my body needs daily. If you want to take ownership of your health, it starts with AG1. Try AG1 and get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D3K2 and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first purchase. Go to drinkag1.com/thoughtsfromapage. That's drinkag1.com/thoughtsfromapage. Check it out. And now back to my show. Welcome, Sally. How are you today?
I'm very well. Thank you very much for having me, Cindy.
I am so glad you are here because I absolutely loved The Keeper of Stories and I cannot wait to talk about it.
Well, that is lovely. It's always good to talk about my book, so delighted to be here.
Well, and you just celebrated a big publishing milestone, 250,000 books sold, and I understand since you had that milestone that actually it's closer to 300,000 now. That is just amazing. Congratulations.
Thank you very much. And I think what has made me so happy is this is a book, it's my debut novel. It's a book that has grown through readers' word of mouth. So that is a particularly lovely thing for me as a writer, to know that you are connecting with people.
Absolutely. And so because your book is just now publishing in the US in January, but it published in the UK before, when did it publish in the UK?
It came out in the spring, so nearly a year ago now. But it was my first book. It was within part of HarperCollins, but a very small imprint. And it didn't really have much of a budget behind it. So when my agent was trying to sell it overseas, there wasn't a lot of interest. I'm an unknown, really. But over time, because it has grown, because it's become a bit of a phenomenon in the UK, they've now sold it in 21 countries. And I'm absolutely delighted it's going to be in the US. So obviously, I really hope readers in the US enjoy it.
Oh, they will. When I posted on Instagram about it, a number of people were like, oh, that's in my pile. And a number of people were like, oh, I've already read it and loved it. And all the reviews on Goodreads are so good. I am sure it's going to take off. It's just such a wonderful story.
I must admit, when people first started posting about my book, I wouldn't look at the reviews because I was thinking, oh my gosh, what if people don't like it? And it was a friend of mine who actually just read me some. She said, you've got to hear this. So now I'm just absolutely delighted.
I think that's actually a great way to do it because even though people talk all the time about don't tag authors in negative reviews, don't make unkind comments and tag them, people still are so clueless and do that. There's no need for that at all. So I have only seen glowing reviews, but I know sometimes, people can just be unkind. So having somebody filter it for you is a great idea.
No, and I now have looked at some of there. Very, very occasionally there'll be a negative comment, and one of the things that has come up is that it's a story that takes a while to get into. But actually, I think that's a fair point. I mean, other people have said it's they haven't been able to put the book down, but I think because I'm writing about a woman who is the keeper of stories, she collects people's stories. You have to illustrate what stories she's collecting, which means that it takes a while to go, oh, yeah, right. So there's that story and that story. And it does come together. But I would just please say to readers, stick with it.
I didn't think it was slow at all or that it took any amount of time to get going. I literally sat down, started reading, fell in love with Janice. And I love the dog, Decius, that she kind of becomes the keeper of or the minder for. And I just thought it was such a wonderful story. But before we dive into anything else, why don't you give me a quick synopsis for those that won't have read it yet?
Well, it's a book that is based on the idea that everyone has a story to tell, which is something that is dear to my heart because I do think, and I'm sure your listeners will know this, you meet people and you're chatting and they suddenly tell you something and you think, oh my goodness, I wouldn't have expected that. And what I thought about was a woman who didn't think she had a story to tell, or certainly not one she was prepared to share. And what would she do? And I had this idea of somebody who collected other people's stories to try and make sense of her life. She's in a difficult time in her life and she does have secrets. So she's a cleaner. She was a very good cleaner. So she can choose really who she wants to clean for. But she comes across one woman, a very tricky woman. But this woman is the first person who really presses her for her story. And that's where the book starts to really take off.
Well, I loved the idea that she was the keeper of stories and that even though she's this phenomenal cleaner, she gets to each house and she starts cleaning. And then they're like, come have a cup of coffee, have some tea, and they want to talk with her and tell them whatever it is they want to tell her. And I just thought that, that is interesting because we all do have stories and sometimes we don't necessarily think we do. And so she was really resisting the idea that she had her own story.
Also, I think with Janice, she is a humble woman who underestimates herself. But because she's not a loud, or outstanding character in some ways, that people do confide in her. She's that quiet person that people want to tell their story to. And so she is a sort of a good vessel for stories, and she makes very good use of them.
She does. And in addition to focusing on stories, there's so many other themes throughout the book. The importance of community, intergenerational relationships, finding your own path, and reckoning with the past. You weave a lot in.
Yes, I think it really comes from stories, but if you start with stories, that will take you to lots of different places. And I very much wanted to write about how you find within the ordinary, you find the extraordinary, because that has certainly been my experience of people, is that there's a lot of, good people out there doing their best. And sometimes, obviously, that's not always reflected in the news we hear. But I wanted to be a bit of a champion for that.
What about the intergenerational relationships? I feel like that's becoming a more and more popular storyline. I think maybe as the way society has moved, where people are farther away from their relatives and their grandparents and all of that, that some of those things have broken down a little bit. And so I feel like I'm seeing that theme in stories more, and I just love it. And it clearly works well in your story.
I think I've been very influenced by the women I've known, because I do have friends of very different ages. I'm a woman of 61, but I have friends who are in their 40s and I have friends who are in their 80s. So that definitely resonated with me. And I very much wanted to write about it and drew on my own experience. Although I have to say, I don't know anybody who is quite like Mrs. B. But
that was going to be my next question, was if you had an inspiration for her, or if you created her, or how she came about, because she's fantastic.
All the characters really are from my imagination. However, the stories that Janice collects are based on truth, most of them. So when I had the idea for the book, I spent a year before I even started writing, researching stories. So I spoke to my friends, acquaintances, family, and said, have you ever come across somebody where they've sort of, really surprised you by their story? So I collected all those stories, obviously with their permission, and I included them in the book. Obviously, I changed them sometimes to fit the narrative or to mask whose story it was. But I love the idea that woven within the book are true stories, because I think it is fair to say you just couldn't make up some of the things that we hear in real life.
I think that is so true. And I have this conversation fairly often with authors, that the things that are actual stories or actual events that are in their books are often the ones that people say, oh, there's no way that would really happen. And the things that they make up, people are like, oh, yeah, okay. But it is true. Truth is stranger than fiction.
It really is. I was talking to a friend the other day about some real life circumstance. And I said, if I put that in a book, people wouldn't believe it. So I'm quite interesting as an author trying to get that balance right.
And I'll see in author notes sometimes they will say, okay, these things actually are true, and these other things I made up, just to make sure people understand, okay, this actually did happen.
Yes, definitely. And I think with my books, I'm thinking about what I want to write in the future and what I've written in the past, because I have written more books before this one actually got taken up. I am very interested in history. So I think I will always write contemporary books, but that have a historical thread through them. And of course, that is going to be based on truth. But there again, it's those stories you come across which make you go, oh my goodness, I can't believe that this hasn't been written about, or that people don't know about this. And that's the sort of thing I would like to bring out through my books.
And that's the sort of thing I like to read. So that's great.
That's good. I like that.
Well, let's talk about the wonderful dog, a fox terrier, correct?
A fox terrier called Decius,
who is just so funny. I love the dialogue that Janice ascribes to him. He is just a hoot and you just want to hug him. He made the book.
I think with Decius, he kind of took over because he came out from a place where Janice is a very good cleaner. Why would she clean for this horrible couple who feature in the book? And I thought, well, if they had a really nice dog, then that might keep her coming back each week. So that was the starting point. I then looked at lots of different sorts of dogs. I don't actually have a dog. And I think I'm most proud of is that a lot of fox terrier owners have written to me and said, oh, you clearly have a fox terrier and you clearly understand fox terriers. But the funny thing was once I started writing Decius, I had no idea how much he was going to swear. That literally, he completely took over. I had no idea. I was typing away thinking, Decius, your language. Because obviously Janice is imagining from his expressions, what's going through his mind. But he really kind of wrote himself, and I became very fond of Decius.
I did too. And his facial expressions, you just did such a wonderful job of explaining like what he was looking like. And then Janice, ascribing language to him and saying, okay, this is what he's saying now. But just a wonderful character. I would have thought you had a dog as well.
Now, I'm very proud of the fact that I could ride a dog and not have a dog. I do have some friends who've got a fox terrier and they brought him round so that I could have some photographs with him. But no, I don't actually have a dog.
Well, what was it like plotting the story out? Because you have a number of characters that interweave together as time goes on. But did you sit down and just write it straight through? Did you write the different characters and then try to put them together? What did that look like?
I'm very much a planner when it comes to writing. My daughter Libby Page, who is an author, and she's, has led the way really in terms of, our careers as writers. She's more intuitive. She's a writer with planning. I plan and then the writing sort of takes over. So I did sit down and think, what stories do I want for Janice to collect? And how did I want the book to pan out? Obviously, within that, sometimes it took a different turn as I was writing it. But yes, I was planning it. And I also had things I wanted to reflect on about stories, themes like, is it about having one story or do we have many stories? Is it about perhaps a perfect moment in your life or something you've achieved? So there were things I wanted to mull over as I was writing. So I did have a way of weaving those and planning them within the book.
Because I would think that would be complicated initially. So planning it out probably helps a lot. And you mentioned your daughter, Libby Page. And I just want to say, I absolutely loved her book, The Lido, which in the US then became Mornings with Rosemary when it came out in paperback. And I just recently highlighted it because I've started a new series called Read Alike Requests. Someone will send in a book that they love, and then I will provide them 3 suggestions for a similar book. And I provided Mornings with Rosemary as one of my suggestions because I just loved it.
Oh, that's lovely to hear. I'm obviously incredibly proud of her, particularly because she wrote that book when she was 23. And she's now written, 4 other books. But she was always a writer. As she was growing up, she just wrote. She used to go up to her bedroom after school and she wrote. That's what she did. And even from a sort of 8-year-old, I was reading her work and going, oh my goodness. And she was going, but you're my mum, you're going to say it's good. And I was going, no, this is really good. So I was never surprised that she became an author. But in a funny way, it stopped me writing because in our family, Libby was the writer. I had done some nonfiction books. I'd photographed and written books about flower shops, following the seasons and the flowers through an English country flower shop. But I didn't realize I was a creative writer. But once I started, I couldn't stop. It was like it was unleashed within me, and I just love it.
I was curious about that because you started writing fiction a little later, but I saw you had the nonfiction books, and I was wondering how you made the switch, or actually just added it. I guess you don't have to switch. You can keep writing nonfiction as well, but how you decided to write fiction.
I think with the writing fiction, maybe Libby's success, Libby's journey had influenced me. So maybe subconsciously within the back of my mind, thinking about stories, thinking about writing. But I literally woke up one morning and had an idea for a book in my head, which wasn't The Keeper of Stories. It was a completely different book, but it just was like, it lit me up. It was like, oh my goodness, I want to write this. And I wrote it. And I wrote a book in about 3 months. I sat and I wrote it. It's still there on my computer. I go back to it occasionally, and I have to confess it's not very good. But I have a lot of other books I've written, which I know are going to come out. But this one, I keep looking back at it and thinking, nah, that it really is not very good. But maybe one day. But I will always be grateful to that book because it got me started and it taught me how much I love to write.
I think it's wonderful when people write at any age, and it's something new to you to do fiction in your 60s. And I think people should try new things all the time. And I love seeing all these authors that have fiction debuts when they're not in their 20s and 30s.
I think that's true. Anybody who's listening who's older will know you experience so much in your life. And so something like writing, you have so much more to draw upon because you've lived longer. And I think I would say to anybody, you can do anything at any stage in your life.
I think that's exactly right. And I think the longer you live, as you said, the more stories you have, the more you've experienced. And I love reading about characters of a wide range of ages as well. And I think sometimes people, as they get a little older, are tackling those type of characters more.
I think so. And I'm not sure about the US, but in the UK, the people who are the big readers are women over 40. So your audience, you have a big audience who are interested, not always in older characters, but not necessarily always in younger characters. They might well be drawn to somebody like Janice, who is, slightly older, middle-aged woman who has more of a history.
I think that's exactly right. Well, what surprised you the most when you were writing this one?
Desi is his language, obviously. I think how much I loved it, which of course is a lovely thing to discover, isn't it? That you're doing something you really enjoy. Having said that, as I was writing it, I didn't have an agent, I didn't have a publisher. So you are writing in isolation. But no, just the sheer joy of writing was, I think, the thing that surprised me the most.
Did it help because Libby's published a number of books to at least understand the path to publication?
Very much so. Knowing how she went about it, knowing how the industry worked through Libby really helped. And she was very encouraging. Having said that, Page as a surname is very common. So when I was applying to agents and then publishers, nobody knew I was her mum, which I'm really proud of. So I went through what they call the slush pile, where actually an agent takes you on, not because somebody's recommended you, but because they've worked through, your work has come in and they chose to represent you.
I can see that because I really do think this story resonates with so many different people. And anyone who picks it up is going to find something in it that they think, oh, I learned from this, or I love these characters, or these are just a wonderful group of people to spend time with. I can see where an agent would pick it right up.
I think what's interesting, Cindy, is that, it took me a long, long time to get an agent. And when my lovely agent did send out The Keeper of Stories, there was only one publisher who offered for it. And that was from a very small imprint of HarperCollins. And actually, when we were at the celebration a couple of days ago, because it sold so many copies, it was lovely to be able to acknowledge the editor, Charlotte Ledger, who was the woman who spotted it. And also, I think for her to know that she saw it, she bought it when nobody else was interested.
Yes, and you can go back to all those people and say, ha. No, but that is wonderful when someone takes a chance, and I think that's great. And it's wonderful that it paid off for her as well.
And she did say to me in the lift on the way down, she said, I do love it when you remind people I was the only one who
yes. I'm sure she does, because she's like, thank you very much.
Yep.
I think the publishing world is just so interesting because you just can't always quite figure out how's it going to work, what's going to happen. And a book like yours and, a number of others I can think about, they just sort of end up with a life of their own, just keep chugging along. And all of a sudden you're at 300,000 copies, which is quite amazing in this time because, people are often happy to sell 10,000 copies.
No, I can tell you I am absolutely delighted. And then at Christmas, the big thing to have on your book is that you're a Sunday Times bestseller. And the 2 weeks of Christmas, I became a Sunday Times bestseller. And that was my agent's assistant sent me a lovely email. And she said, I was trying to tell my husband what a huge deal this is. You're a debut novelist. The book came out in the spring, so it didn't come out around Christmas time. You're in the Christmas bit where it's so competitive. She said, I was trying to tell my husband what an amazing feat that is. And so that was something I had never expected. And I was just overjoyed with that.
Well, I think it does make a great gift. Like if you're looking for a book for somebody for the holidays, this is perfect because it has everything in it.
I do think very early on, I could see that it was being gifted because on Amazon, there is a little chart where they look at the books that are most often given. And I was number 2 on that. And I wasn't, I was still really unknown. And I think because it's a book it's about friendship, it's about hope. It does deal with some difficult issues, but it is about hope. It's about the ordinary being extraordinary, that I hope it makes people feel good about things and that is something that they would want to pass on to other friends and their family. So I think that's probably why it did so well at Christmas.
I think so as well. Well, I always love to talk about titles and covers. Your cover is just beautiful. And once you read the book, you really then are able to pull out all the different things like Decius and the key and the music and the butterflies, all of it. And I think they did such a stellar job on your cover. Do you just love it? And is your cover the same in the UK as the US?
Yes, it is. And okay. Oh my goodness, it took us so long to come up with that cover. And there again, I'm very grateful to my editor, Charlotte Ledger, because we saw so many covers. And every time I saw a cover, I was thinking, I don't like this. I don't know how to say yet again, I don't like this. But luckily, Charlotte was of the same view. She said, no, this is not this isn't what the right positioning. It's not good enough. And she kept pushing back and pushing back. And when we saw this cover, we were all delighted. We went, that's the cover. It's just a beautiful cover. And I think it will, when I do subsequent books, I'm sure what will happen is it will be an evolution of that type of cover. And it's interesting in the countries who've bought the Keeper of Stories, most that I've seen so far are using variations on that cover.
Well, it really does encapsulate the story. And I love that blue, that just deep blue. There's so much talk these days about the cover being important on the book, but also being important digitally when you see it on Instagram, when you see it on Barnes & Noble or wherever you're going to see it, small or large, you're going to know it's your book.
Yes, and I think the imprint I'm with are what they call digital first. So they really press the ebook and the audio, but they do print a paperback in the UK. But I think where they're particularly good on covers is they understand it has to work as a smaller thumbnail. So sometimes you'll see the most beautiful books in a bookshop, but when you see them as a very small image, it doesn't really work. Whereas One More Chapter, which is the name of the publisher in the UK, they realized you have to work as a thumbnail and then also as a full book. And I think they've got that absolutely spot on.
I agree, but it does make it a lot more complicated because you have to be able to have the book work for both. And it doesn't always happen, as you mentioned, but that also has to just be tricky in the design.
Yes, and I was very grateful for there was an in-house designer who came up with it. And when I eventually met her, I hugged her because I just was happy.
I love that. You're like, we finally got there. Thank you. Well, what about the title?
I had a very different title, and that title was thought up by my editor, Charlotte Ledger. She said when she read the book, that title came to her mind. And when she came to me with it, I went, yes, absolutely. I think I'd got something about a story collector, and she said something about the Keeper of Stories. It's softer, and it's a sort of big idea that somebody is a keeper of stories. So I was very happy to go with her suggestion.
And Janice is a keeper of stories.
Very much so. Yes, she is.
Well, this has been so much fun, and I really could talk about your book all day, but I guess we can't do that. So before we wrap up, what have you read recently that you really liked?
I've read Still Life by Sarah Winman, which is just a beautiful book. And as a writer, you always want to push yourself. And when I read Sarah Winman's books, her language and her writing is exquisite. It's like eating delicious food. And it makes me feel like I want to do better. I want to write better. It's set in Florence and London, and it has extraordinary characters in it, but they're all completely believable. And it is a book it's about hope, as well as having fantastic themes in it about history of art and globe making. I mean, it's just a huge book, but it's wonderful.
It is a big book. I have it. And I always think, okay, I'm going to pick it up now because people rave about it, but then it is big.
It is. And all I'd say to you is if you struggle in the first couple of chapters, keep going, because like you, everybody recommended it. And when I started it, I was like, oh, and I read a few chapters and I put it down, and I nearly didn't pick it up again. And I'm so glad I did, because it is an absolute beauty of a book.
Okay, that's good to know. I actually had started it and struggled a little bit, and she doesn't use quotation marks, which normally doesn't bother me, but for some reason it was really hiccuping me when I was trying to read her book.
Yeah.
But it sounds like I need to just go back to it and push through those initial chapters. Okay, that's good to know. Well, I think I said this when I went on Houston Life here in Houston about your book when I talked about it, but it was one of those stories that when I finished it, I just literally hugged it. I just loved it. So thank you so much for coming on the Thoughts from a Page podcast, Sally. It was just delightful to get to hear more about the behind the scenes.
Well, thank you, Cindy. It's been really nice talking to you.
Are you tired of seeing your teen or young adult struggle on a path that clearly isn't the right fit? Is your teenager confused about which direction to take after high school? The future of work is changing rapidly, and our kids need to know all of the options available after high school so they're empowered to make the choice that is best for them. In each episode, we explore the latest trends that are shaping the opportunities of today and tomorrow. I'm your host, Betsy Jewell, and this is the High School Hamster Wheel Podcast.
Thank you so much for listening to my podcast. If you like this episode, and I hope you did, please follow me on Instagram at Thoughts From a Page. Consider joining my Patreon group to access bonus content and support the podcast. Tell all of your friends about the show and rate it or subscribe to it wherever you listen to your podcasts. I would really appreciate it. The book discussed in this episode can be purchased at my bookshop storefront, and the link is in the show notes. I hope you'll tune in next time.
You might be surprised to know that not all serial killers are straight cisgender white men, and the victims of true crime are not a monolith either. She's Wendy and I'm Beth, and together we host Fruit Loops Serial Killers of Color, a true crime podcast.
Together we take deep dives into the true crime stories about marginalized and minoritized perps and victims that often go untold.
We also provide the context and nuance that these stories deserve. At Fruit Loops, we're serving up true crime with a side of history, society, culture, and some fun.
Listen to Fruit Loops Serial Killers of Color on Spotify, Google Play, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.